بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شفاء لكم جماعة الكل، وباش نبداو الآن البرنامج. نجموا تواصلوا إذا كان مازلتوا ما كملتوش العشاء ولا الدسير، واصلوا في عقلكم، جوست حاولوا معناها ما تعملوش برشا حس باش نجموا الناس الكل نسمعوا بعضنا. يسرني ويسعدني أن أرحب بثلاثة مداخلات، ثلاثة أساتذة جامعيين مختصين في تونس وفي شمال أفريقيا بصفة عامة، باش يعطينا يعني تقييمهم للوضع في تونس ورأيهم أو آرائهم حول ما يجري في تونس. وهم السيد الأستاذ فانسون غيسير من فرنسا، والأستاذ بيل لورنس أو ويليام لورنس من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، والأستاذ نادر الهاشمي أيضا من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. فبدون أن أطيل عليكم نحاولوا 12 minutes à peu près 12 à 15 maximum 15 vraiment 15 ça. Donc monsieur Vincent Guesser, s'il vous plaît.
Merci pour l'invitation à parler. D'abord, de l'émotion. Je retrouve ici dans cette salle beaucoup d'amis de ce que je n'appellerais même pas l'opposition tunisienne, mais de ce que j'appellerais la résistance tunisienne, la résistance démocratique. Aujourd'hui en Tunisie, malheureusement, les frontières sont brouillées et tout le monde s'invente des passés de résistants. Mais je peux garantir que dans cette salle, il y a des vrais résistants, il y a des gens qui ont combattu courageusement, et ce ne sont pas des gens qui sont devenus résistants le 15 janvier 2011, mais qui étaient résistants dès les débuts de la dictature. Malheureusement, l'optimisme des premiers jours de la révolution, l'unanimisme patriotique, l'idée que tous les Tunisiens étaient unis contre la dictature, a cédé la place à une certaine forme de pessimisme. Il est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, quand on écoute les hommes politiques, les femmes politiques, les médias, ces fameux médias tunisiens dont on a l'impression qu'ils sont bénalistes sans Ben Ali, mais c'est encore pire parce qu'ils ne sont même pas forcés d'être bénalistes, mais ils sont le toujours. Donc c'est quelqu'un plus surprenant, pas tous heureusement, je vous rassure. Quand on écoute les médias, quand on écoute même les citoyens ordinaires, sincères et honnêtes, on s'aperçoit que malheureusement il y a une certaine déception, désillusion par rapport à la transition démocratique et même l'idée que peut-être que finalement c'était mieux avant. C'était mieux avant, cette formule terrible que l'on entend parfois dans la bouche de certaines personnes médiatisées qui disaient finalement Ben Ali, c'était pas aussi mal que ça. C'est vrai que de ce point de vue-là, je crois qu'il y a une appréhension compréhensible, émotionnelle, passionnelle, l'inquiétude, la peur, et ce sont des sentiments, des réactions totalement légitimes. Mais le témoignage que je peux faire en tant que scientifique, politologue, ayant travaillé sur ce pays et travaillant sur d'autres pays, ayant aussi des contacts avec des collègues qui ont analysé d'autres processus de transition, c'est que les transitions politiques, qu'elles se situent en Amérique latine, qu'elles se situent en Europe orientale, qu'elles se situent sur le continent africain, qu'elles se situent dans le monde arabe, ce ne sont pas des chemins, je dirais, parsemés de fleurs, de jasmin, mais ce sont aussi des chemins avec des cailloux, ce sont des chemins sinueux, ce sont des chemins qui demandent patience, ce sont des chemins qui demandent des compromis, ce sont des chemins qui demandent des dialogues. On n'a jamais vu dans l'histoire du monde des transitions qui se faisaient en 1 jour, ou en 8 jours, ou en 10 jours, ou en 1 mois, mais en plusieurs années. Oui, les transitions sont des processus nécessairement longs, qui demandent justement une certaine retenue par rapport aux émotions et aux passions. Et de ce point de vue-là, les observations comparatives que l'on peut faire avec d'autres régimes politiques montrent que les transitions ne sont pas des zones au ciel bleu, mais plutôt de ce que nous appellerons, nous politologues, des zones grises, des zones d'ambivalence, où il y a encore de l'ancien, des structures d'anciens régimes avec du nouveau. Et tout ça se mélange pour produire des formes un peu bizarres, un peu mixtes, un peu hybrides, où c'est un peu d'autoritarisme, un peu de démocratie, un peu des deux, un mélange un peu unique qui donne aujourd'hui effectivement cette impression d'incertitude. De ce point de vue-là, j'ai envie de dire qu'il ne faut pas s'angoisser de ces ambiguïtés. Il ne faut pas s'inquiéter de ces formes d'hybridation et qu'elles appartiennent malheureusement au lot commun de toutes les transitions politiques. Oui, qu'il y ait encore en Tunisie de ce que nous appellerions, nous politologues, des enclaves autoritaires. Oui, qu'il y ait encore des résurgences de l'ancien système. Oui, qu'il y ait encore, je dirais, des comportements, des attitudes, des réflexes hérités de 50 ans de dictature. J'ai presque envie de dire, même si ça vous apparaît bizarre, c'est presque normal. Mais le tout, c'est de pouvoir malheureusement l'accepter. Et pour reprendre la formule que le président de la République reprend parfois, qu'il a lui-même empruntée à un auteur arabe, la meilleure posture, ce n'est pas l'optimisme naïf, ce n'est pas le pessimisme radical, c'est ce qu'on appelle souvent l'optimo-pessimisme ou le pessimo-optimisme, c'est-à-dire un peu des deux. Et c'est comme ça, probablement, que la Tunisie avancera. Deuxième chose, c'est effectivement ce sentiment de bipolarisation, de fermeture, de radicalisation. Ce sentiment finalement que la Tunisie serait coupée en deux. Quand on lit parfois les médias français, les médias européens et malheureusement aussi les médias tunisiens, parce que ça c'est très facile d'accuser les médias entre guillemets occidentaux, on a l'impression qu'il y aurait d'un côté une Tunisie islamiste, religieuse, certains disent intégriste, et puis de l'autre une Tunisie séculariste, laïque. L'idée que finalement il y aurait deux sortes de Tunisiens. Les Tunisiens qui regardent vers l'avenir, vers la démocratie, vers le progrès, et ceux qui regardent vers l'arrière. Moi je dirais que cette vision, malheureusement, que beaucoup d'entre nous ici dans cette salle, issus de la résistance démocratique, pensaient être propre au bénalisme, propre à la dictature, malheureusement elle agit encore aujourd'hui sous la démocratie. Cette bipolarisation islamiste ou anti-islamiste, malheureusement, elle continue à produire du sens politique en Tunisie. Mais j'ai envie de vous rassurer un tout petit peu. N'est-ce pas finalement un discours d'élite? N'est-ce pas un discours de politicien? N'est-ce pas un discours de professionnels des médias? Mais est-ce vraiment le discours des citoyens ordinaires? Je ne pense pas. Je pense que la très grande majorité des citoyens tunisiens ne se sentent pas le type idéal de l'islamisme ou le type idéal du sécularisme. Je pense qu'en Tunisie, il n'y a pas des homo islamicus integritus radicalus et des homo laïcis occidentalus francisus, mais il y a d'abord des citoyens tunisiens qui ont des préoccupations sociales, des préoccupations économiques et qui ne se reconnaissent de moins en moins dans ce jeu politique fait de l'anathème, de la violence verbale et de la bipolarisation. Et c'est un risque d'ailleurs pour le système politique tunisien, ces hommes et ces femmes politiques qui pensent à courir derrière les mandats et qui oublient les citoyens tunisiens dans leurs attentes sociales, dans leurs attentes économiques et dans le refus massif de cette bipolarisation idéologique et culturelle qui vise à nous faire croire qu'il y aurait une Tunisie islamiste qui ferait face à une Tunisie laïque et une Tunisie laïque qui ferait face à une Tunisie islamiste. De ce point de vue-là, oui, il y a un risque. Le risque, ce n'est pas celle d'une révolution islamiste ou d'une révolution séculariste qui couperait des têtes, mais c'est une véritable fracture, un véritable fossé entre une partie des élites tunisiennes et les citoyens ordinaires qui attendent, je dirais, que le débat soit à la hauteur, et il n'est pas toujours malheureusement à la hauteur dans la transition. Alors quels sont, de ce point de vue-là, les défis démocratiques? Je ne suis pas là en donneur de leçons, je suis en modeste témoin de l'histoire récente de la Tunisie, de l'histoire de la résistance, de l'histoire malheureusement aussi du régime autoritaire, du bénalisme, les défis démocratiques, bien sûr, la question socio-économique, les inégalités sociales territoriales qui restent frappantes en Tunisie. Je dirais que cette formule terrible du bénalisme qu'on appelait les zones d'ombre du bénalisme, malheureusement, restent aussi les zones d'ombre de la démocratie. Et que de ce point de vue-là, cette fracture sociale territoriale entre une Tunisie réputée utile, héritée de la colonisation, et une Tunisie oubliée reste prégnante. De ce point de vue-là, je dirais que tout le monde parle aujourd'hui de miracle, de remède miracle en parlant de décentralisation. Oui, la décentralisation institutionnelle, oui. La décentralisation politique, oui. La décentralisation administrative, oui. Mais la première décentralisation que doivent faire les élites tunisiennes, c'est la décentralisation mentale. Arrêtez de se prendre pour des élites qui s'imaginent apprendre la démocratie aux peuples tunisiens. Et cette décentralisation mentale, ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire, comme nous le disions avec mes collègues tunisiens et mon professeur Michel Camo, ce complexe de la démocratie tutélaire. S'imaginer, parce qu'on est tunisois ou sahélien, que l'on possède les gènes de la démocratie et que l'on va apprendre la démocratie aux gueux de Sidi Bouzid, de Kasserine, du sud et du nord-ouest. Non, des gens du 08, du 07 ou des 0 quelconques ne sont pas moins démocrates que ces élites tunisiennes qui font tous les jours la preuve qu'ils n'ont pas complètement rompu avec l'autoritarisme. Et je dirais qu'avant de parler de décentralisation en Tunisie, il faut que les élites elles-mêmes se décentrent mentalement et comprennent qu'elles n'ont pas le monopole de la formule politique tunisienne. Et de ce point de vue, comme je dis, la véritable révolution, ce n'est pas la décentralisation administrative, c'est la décentralisation des esprits et des cerveaux qui apprennent davantage à regarder vers l'intérieur du pays. Deuxième chose et deuxième défi que l'on voit, et je le regrette, nous sommes ici dans cette salle, ici il y a des combattants, ils se reconnaîtront, il y a des résistants, je vois un ici, l'autre fille, qui ont perdu leur emploi, qui ont été harcelés professionnellement, qui ont été harcelés familialement, qui ont été, mais qui en sont toujours restés dignes. Ces gens-là se sont battus pour une chose, durant les années de la dictature, bien avant la révolution. Ils ne se sont pas battus pour faire un régime politique particulier, privilégiant leur parti particulier, leur camp philosophique, mais ils se sont battus toujours en dialoguant. Les initiatives de dialogue, où l'opposition était unie, à Paris, à Londres, à Tunis, où ils se réunissaient ensemble, islamistes, non islamistes, laïcs, non laïcs, femmes, hommes, ils se réunissaient ensemble et ils apportaient un message commun. Nous voulons lutter contre la dictature. Nous voulons être libres. Et cette fameuse formule du Conseil national des libertés, la peur a changé de camp. Or aujourd'hui, qu'est-ce que l'on voit? C'est que finalement on revient au vieux clivage. Ce clivage islamiste laïque, qui est un clivage artificiel, comme je l'ai dit, qui est un clivage qui ne représente pas, selon moi, les aspirations profondes de nombreux citoyens tunisiens, mais qui pourtant continue à structurer le débat politique, le débat médiatique, et pire, la vision des médias occidentaux et de nombre de diplomatie occidentale à l'égard de la Tunisie. Donc de ce point de vue-là, il y a un autre défi, un autre combat, celui de ne pas oublier d'abord qu'en Tunisie, il y a eu des résistants. Et que cette réhabilitation, moi je suis français, je suis petit-fils, arrière-petit-fils de résistants. Il ne faut pas oublier que la libération de la France en 1944 et 1945, elle a porté des résistants au pouvoir qui n'avaient pas peur de dire aux collabos, d'accord, on ne va pas vous faire du mal, mais pour l'instant, vous ne prendrez pas le pouvoir parce que c'est une France de la résistance, c'est la France de la sécurité sociale, c'est la France de la République. Là, je dirais qu'il ne faut pas éliminer les autres. Il ne faut pas brandir des brevets de moudjahid comme on l'a assisté dans certains pays. Mais malgré tout, il faut réhabiliter quelque part ce qu'a été l'âme de la résistance tunisienne, c'est-à-dire une âme qui dit il n'y a pas d'islamistes, il n'y a pas de sécularistes, il n'y a que des combattants pour la démocratie en Tunisie. Et de ce point de vue-là, ne jamais oublier ce qu'a été cette histoire, une histoire de combat contre la dictature, qui n'avait pas la couleur verte, la couleur bleue ou qui avait la couleur rouge, mais qui avait bien un objectif, créer une démocratie saine dans ce pays. Et je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup Vincent, c'était une très belle intervention. Maintenant, c'est Bill Lawrence, c'est un ami qui connaît très bien la Tunisie, l'Algérie et le Maroc d'ailleurs, et qui est aussi un professeur à George Washington University et le président de l'association tuniso-américaine à Washington. Donc c'est un ami de la Tunisie et je suis heureux de l'accueillir ici parmi nous. Ah oui, donc باش نتكلم بالانجلي دونك اللي حاب ما يعرفش الانجلي عندنا الالات الترجمه موجوده.
Vive la révolution. Moi je voterai Vincent. Alors, moi je vais parler un peu de le même sujet, mais en anglais, donc il faut absolument chercher les And contrary to the biography of the program, I've never worked for the Pentagon. It says something about me. These are the facts. So I'm not representing the Pentagon. I teach North African politics and international relations at George Washington University. And some of my remarks tonight will reflect my academic perspective, which is sometimes critical of what is going on, like the economics professor this morning. I am also a senior fellow at the Project on Middle East Democracy, and some of my remarks will reflect my thoughts on Tunisia's quest for democracy and the region's quest for democracy, and Tunisia's success in this regard. As Radwan said, I'm also the newly elected president of the American Tunisian Association, the oldest and most established amicale organization between the U.S. and Tunisia, which was founded in 1960. Which was founded in 1960s to deal with the Tunisian flood that the authorities had covered up and hadn't fully reported on, and a group of diplomats and other people concerned with Tunisia got together to coordinate international assistance to Tunisia during that period, and the organization continued afterwards. And on behalf of American Tunisian Association, let me welcome you as well. I'm also the former North Africa Director for International Crisis Group for the last several years. We wrote several reports on Tunisia, one called The Tunisian Way, La Voie Tunisienne, which came out shortly after the revolution, and I still think is one of the best accounts of the revolution in French or in English. We also wrote the first report on security and justice reform, which came out in May 2012, with a list of recommendations that still is valid and hasn't been implemented. We also came up with the first critical report on the economic and social situation in Tunisia. The report came out in June 2012 and provoked a debate here in Tunisia about how much of the problems in Tunisia were economic and how much were political, and maybe we needed to rethink economics. As a result of that, our report was criticized by several political parties in Tunisia in this highly polarized media environment, and I did my one radio interview ever on that Shabab here, my broken Arabic, to try to defend the methodology of the report, which we worked on for 9 months. The basic argument of the report being that the causes of the Tunisian the Tunisian revolution were more economic than political. Most of the effort of Tunisia and the international community was more political than economic, and the economy was getting worse. So the conditions for further political instability were there because of the decreasing economic performance. Our report was criticized by Tunisians who felt that Tunisia was recovering quickly, unemployment had dropped slightly, and other indicators had gotten better in terms of growth. But we were aware of that, and we factored in what most economists call what's a J-curve. After any revolution, things get significantly worse for a couple of years for very demonstrable reasons. And we heard recently from Prime Minister Joma, and today at the economic session, how bad the fiscal situation is in Tunisia. And it's dire, it's quite bad. And part of my job, I'll be back in Washington on Tuesday, is to help with the Joma visit. I think I have 6 different sessions with Prime Minister Joma to try to make the economic case in Washington for assistance to Tunisia. Our report was praised by Marzouki, it was praised by UTECA, UGTT, and the Minister of Finance. The Minister of Finance called it le dernier mot sur le problème économique en Tunisie. So it's a good report, I recommend that you look at it. I also have written op-eds on Tunisian, mostly more economics than politics, in The Guardian, in Jeune Afrique, in Hayat, and in Sharq al-Awsat. So you can find those online as well. I came here the first time to Tunisia in 1989 and went to the Peace Corps training session in Mahdia. It was a wonderful introduction, and had lunch with Ambassador Palatro, who was running the negotiations with the PLO at the time, and learned a lot about that process. I came back as a Fulbright scholar in 96, 97 to work on Algeria. Algeria at the time was, in many ways, going through what Egypt is going through right now. I actually gave the first public address on what was going on in Algeria and Tunisia. It was a taboo subject here. I like to say with a great deal of veracity that all of the hundreds of Algerians I interviewed in Tunisia spoke openly to me. They all accepted to be interviewed, and no Tunisian accepted, not one. And so I learned a little bit about politics. I used to say at the time that Morocco has an open conversation on Algeria and a closed border, and Tunisia has an open border but no conversation, closed conversation. My talk was very popular with the embassies at the time. I got a standing ovation from the French and the American diplomats, and I was heavily criticized by the dean of the University of Algiers as naive and crazy, and I needed to come to Algeria to see what was really going on. And then privately, the Algerian diplomats came up to me afterwards in the garden of Sema here in downtown near the Medina and said, everything you said was correct. We just don't say it publicly in Tunisia. We had a similar experience with the WSIS. I was Tunisia desk officer in charge of U.S.-Tunisian affairs at the State Department in 2005, 2006, and I was responsible for crafting a lot of the messages that were critical of the human rights situation in Tunisia. At the WSIS, the World Summit on the Information Society, we were the only ones that spoke out. Us, the Swiss, and there was the Nobel Prize winner from Iran and a few others, but most of the European governments were quite silent on the situation. When the US delegation spoke, they turned off the cameras in the hallway and stopped the broadcast. And that combined with the human rights and the freedom of the press reporting we were doing, this was the beginning of the long, slow decline of the US-Tunisian relationship, which began then. It almost led to the closing of the American school. And when I came back I came back several times after leading delegations. One time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was playing games with the embassy and canceling all of the meetings that the US government had. So I took my delegation around to Tunisia for 3 days. We had all our meetings, and then we went to the US Embassy on the 4th day, and they said, all your meetings are canceled, per the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I said, that's great, we've seen everybody, red carpets, you know. Tunisians wanted to get to America, but the government was very angry about the criticism they were receiving. We were openly supportive of the October 18th movement. We sent a diplomat down on the second day, which many Tunisians told me saved the October 18th movement because of US diplomatic representation. We also pressed very hard on human rights issues, and my first time meeting with Nahda in September 2011, I met with some people who knew that I worked on their cases at the time as part of the US human rights agenda. I remember once a French diplomat told me in one of my meetings, we're jealous of you Americans. We spend all our time on dual nationals getting them out of jail, but we say nothing publicly on Tunisian human rights. And you Americans, at least you say something. You know, you come out and you say something. I came back also in 2010 as an aide-de-camp for Elias Zerhouni, the President Obama's science envoy to Tunisia and to the MENA region. I started several of the programs, my team and I, that came out of the Cairo speech. One was the Science Envoy program, one was GIST, the Global Innovation through Science and Technology program, another was the Maghreb Digital Library. The Maghreb Digital Library project was interesting because all the Tunisian officials were interested in was monitoring what the digital library was going to be used for, rather than the scientific knowledge and production that it would help generate. Shortly after that, I moved to MEP, where I was in charge of the North Africa programs for about 6 months right after the Tunisian Revolution. So I worked on all the grants for IFIS and NED and NDI, IRI, Creative, and then I quit my job and went to ICG. All of this trajectory of dealing with Tunisia since 1989 has taught me 5 lessons that I'd like to share with you. Number one, and I agree totally with Vincent, he stole my thunder in this point, but I don't believe this debate is about Islamists and secularists. I understand why it's the focus of this conference. I don't even agree with my friend Imad Shaheen, who was in the program, the schedule that was sent out on the internet, who says that there's somehow a cooperation between Muslim Democrats and secular Democrats. I mean, what does that mean? Who's a Muslim? Who's a... I think the term Islamist is very poisoned in the international media environment, and I think the term secular is very poisoned in the Arab area media environment.
So I think we need to start moving away from the terms Islamists and secularists. I understand why they're still being used now, but I think we need to think of maybe some new terms. One way would be to talk about socially liberal Democrats and socially conservative Democrats, or socially liberal Muslims and socially conservative Muslims. We could even talk about social liberals, social conservatives, and social socialists as three camps. If you don't like what liberal means, it has many meanings. But I think part of bridging the gap, part of the theme of this conference is creating dialogue, is rethinking our very categories and our very relationships. The second point I'd like to make is that this so-called debate, this bipolarized debate, as my French colleague said, is not even the key problem here. It's a symptom of other problems, as he correctly said, but it's not the key problem. The key problem is economics and the welfare of the Tunisian people, which is the main cause of the revolution. It's linked to politics, corruption, it's linked to security issues, it's linked to the transitional justice that hasn't happened yet. But we can't make anything dependent on anything else. I hear all the time, we have to fix security before we have to fix politics before, we have to have transitional justice before. No, Tunisians can walk and chew gum at the same time, as we say in English. You have to do everything at once. You can have priorities within sectors. What's our justice priority? What's our political priority? But all of the trains have to leave the station for Tunisia to get where it's going. I don't think that either side in this debate is addressing the core issues, as was indicated in my question today. 50% of Tunisians work in the informal sector, a sector that this government and the previous governments post-revolution are sort of declaring war on. You know, it was started by a guy with a cart who's now considered the problem, right? So we're sort of back to where we started. Bouazizi, of course, was framed as something else during the revolution, right? He was framed as an unemployed university graduate, right? Because we had a lot of the unemployed university graduates who needed a symbol to help with their contribution to the revolution. But the real message here is that informal sector is the problem. We had 400 self-immolations after Bouazizi across the MENA region. 400, ending in deaths. There were more. The more in Algeria than any other country, but over 90% of the self-immolations were people who worked in the informal sector, who were excluded from both the formal sector and the informal sector. And I can't say more emphatically that you can't just fix the formal sector to fix the informal sector. You can't just create up formal jobs and the informal sector goes away. You actually have to mainstream informal sector activity into the formal sector in a whole variety of ways, which I'm happy to address with people after the conference. I had a debate with Mr. Nevely, the former head of the central bank in Washington on this topic in 2012. It was the same day Hillary Clinton spoke at Benghazi, on the Benghazi attack. And I was the speaker right before Hillary, and Nevely, I think, was 3 before me. And he was saying, you know, our problem in Tunisia is the guy with the cart is selling the same problem as the guy in the store, and we need to take care of the informal sector. I heard today about bananas again, right? But this is not the way to go about this, in my opinion. And Nevely spoke again in Washington a few weeks ago, and now he's talking about the business climate and all of the things that young entrepreneurs need to become mainstream and get what they need to succeed economically in Tunisia. My third point, the problem in Tunisia is, the problem and the solution is the same thing. It's what to do with the young people. Now, don't get me wrong, Tunisia's had what demographers already call a demographic transition. So you have the oldest median population in the MENA region. It's 30 for Tunisia, it's 27 for Algeria and Morocco, it's 24 for Libya and Egypt, and 19 in Mauritania and Western Sahara and further down. You have the oldest population, but you have unemployed university graduates. Your problem with your youth is it's highly trained and educated and isn't employed. In fact, the unemployment rate for university graduates is 3 times those for little primary education in Tunisia. So we need to think creatively about what to do with university graduates. Who are also disengaged from politics and not getting very interested in politics these days, traditional politics. You can do all the outreach you want for young people to join your political party. You can have a quota for young people in the parliament. That's not going to mobilize Tunisian youth, highly skeptical of politics as is, to engage in the post-revolutionary project. I gave a speech in 2012 in Hammamet at a conference on employabilité des jeunes. And I used Ivan Illich, the famous, I think he was Eastern European, but we know him as an American educational reformer, who attacked most education as we know it in a famous book called Deschooling America. And in it, he talked about how the most important aspect of education is apprenticeship. Almost everything else is less important, certainly all of the sort of knowledge acquisition. And the future of education needed to be, he's writing in the 1970s, webs of knowledge, right? He's anticipating and transformational moments, that those key moments during one's education where one has a change, and everything else is kind of not as important. He wrote, universal education through schooling is not feasible. Neither new attitudes of teachers towards their pupils, nor the proliferation of educational hardware or software in classroom or the bedroom, nor finally the attempt to expand the pedagog's responsibility until it engulfs his pupils' lifetimes will deliver universal education. The current search for new educational funnels must be reversed into a search for their institutional inverse, educational webs, which heighten the opportunity for each one to transform each moment in his living into one of learning and sharing. So I started to talk about this Illich's vision of education as transformational, webs of learning between equals, etc. And I said one of the solutions in a revolutionary moment is to free up the universities from the Ministry of Education. None of this top-down management. And I got a nice round of applause from the front of the room and the university teams. And then I said, and the next step is we need to free up the departments and the professors from the university administrations so that they can innovate, so that they can tackle social problems, so that they can, and I got a wider applause from the sides, in the middle, where some of this group were. And then I said, and the next thing we have to do, as we do in the best American universities, is free up the best graduate students and students from the professors and let them innovate. And I told the story of Elias Zerhouni, who came up with the idea for the mathematics of cancer scanning that everyone uses for now. If you get a cancer scan, use the mathematics he developed. He developed it in Algeria. He went to Hopkins. His professor said, I don't agree with you. This isn't going to work. I think it's foolish, but I'll give you 6 months. Here's a little bit of money. Why not? Zerhouni comes back to Algeria 4 years later, I think, after he develops this mathematics. The response from the Algerians is, shunta, right? And alesh, right? Why are you doing this thing? And so Zerhouni tells the story. He tried for 6 months, and he said, that's it. The Americans' question is not why, it's why not. And why not you? So he went back to the States, developed this. He became his boss's boss. He ended up being the head of the largest research institution in the world, the NIH, $30 billion annual budget, and 30,000 researchers. And this is someone who wanted to go back to Algeria, and he says their problem in this part of the world isn't the brain drain, it's brain rejection. So think about this a little bit. I had an interesting visit to Nile University before the revolution, where every student gets a course in entrepreneurship, and any unemployed student has open access to the university, nights and weekends, working with professors on what? Problem solving. Solving, engineering, whatever sort of problem that the society needs, hoping to develop commercializable products and services. There's no school for revolutions. Young people in Tunisia had a revolution with no training, right, for revolution. I don't think Tunisians need a lot of training. Most of the international assistants I hear training. I don't think training is what's missing in Tunisia. Any problem can be tackled with what you already have. You have thousands of unemployed university graduates. You have a 70% literacy rate. That can be a 100% literacy rate in 5 years if you just take those university graduates to go out and teach people to read. You can take any sector, public health, development, technology, any sector. If you apply young people in groups to go out and solve the problem, you could do amazing things in this country with the resources that you already have. Water, renewable energy. The access they have to technology and social media alone makes things possible that were never possible before. A lot of the current talk that I hear from the NGOs, US government, they talk about the practice of democracy, educating people about democracy. You learn democracy, as I said on Radio France several times and on Jazeera. You don't learn democracy because someone teaches you democracy. You learn democracy by doing. Doing stuff in organizations that you care about, fighting it out with others, making things happen. That's democratic culture. It's not taught in school. It's not taught in a training class. So this needs to be done from the bottom up. And Tunisia has a legacy of doing this, where Niger, Chad, I think they've had 3,000 coopérants from Tunisia have gone down to Niger and Chad, but we don't have coopération on the French model in Tunisia, where you could deal with a lot of these issues. One of the final points, Oxford University had a very interesting study a few years ago on the whole problem with what they called windfall economics across the MENA region. People looking for sort of one thing that will solve everything, whether it's foreign investment. Well, guess what? The foreign investors follow local investment. They don't precede it. Or whether it's phosphate or hydrocarbon revenues are going to fix everything. Well, you have the problem of the black curse. Whether it's international assistance, well, that doesn't develop capacities. Islamic finance, I've been hearing a lot today. It's a great idea. It helped actually, in US banks, we have Islamic finance, and it helped, the Islamic banks did better during the housing crash than the other banks, right? There's a certain transparent and good things about Islamic banking. Islamic banking is not going to create any jobs. It's not going to deal with the fundamental issues here. Recutting Tunisia's regions, I keep hearing about that, decentralization. That's not going to do anything if you don't have vibrant municipalities that can operationalize that. Agricultural jobs, yes, but that's not where the youth skills are or the youth interests. Political exclusion, I'm hearing about, let's cut part of the workforce out because they work for the RCD. Well, the RCD, not everyone was corrupt in the RCD. I've spoken publicly on this on France 24 and elsewhere. I'm against excluding anybody until you're finished with transitional justice. Then you can talk about exclusions maybe. We don't know who is corrupt. Until they're tried in a courtroom, they shouldn't be a group, and they had suffered from group blame. Why do you want to come back with a group blaming project like exclusion? So the pitfalls, top-down solutions that respond to donor needs rather than societal, local analysis of needs, putting political or security or justice before economics, looking for windfalls and magic bullets from the West, from religion, from any source. Small is beautiful here, and putting together small teams of educated Tunisians to deal with societal problems is going to solve these problems. That's how you make the Tunisian revolution continue and prepare the next generation for the revolutionary society that you want them to inherit. And if Tunisia succeeds, of course, you're not only making democracy and economy work in Tunisia, it has an effect on the whole region. As we were reading today, there's more and more talk around the world of Turkey no longer being the model, of Tunisia being the model. So now is the time to start thinking about how to make this revolution really revolutionary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And